Hey guys, Jules here with another reasoning session, and today I'm going to be talking about the timeline of Cyrus playing out in our own time.
Come now and let us reason together. Come now, we can talk it over.
So the text for today's reasoning session comes from the prophecies of Isha or Isaiah, and this is chapter 45, starting at verse 1. Thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, Yahweh, which call you by your name, am the God of Israel. So historically, Cyrus or Koresh was a Persian king, and he was the guy that actually ruled the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire as it was called at the time, at its peak. And he was a conqueror. Like, he took nations left and right, but he was a benevolent king. A lot of the nations that he took over and annexed as satrapies of the Persian Empire called him Cyrus the Great. But one of the biggest city-states that he took over was ancient Babylon. Now, the city of Babylon was over 500 square kilometers. That's about 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. And it had series of walls. Its outer walls were 87 feet wide. You could easily run chariots on top of these things. They were 321 feet high, and there were between 2 and 3 sets of inner walls, depending on which part of the city we're looking at. These walls were over 70 feet in width. Plus, the city had over 250 watchtowers that were over 400 feet high. The Euphrates River ran through the city, much the way the Thames runs through London. And at one point, there was a bridge 30 feet wide and 1 mile across from one bank of the river to the other. There were huge iron gates at the entrances of the river, and these brick escarpments lined the bank up the river, so you couldn't get into the city. On top of that, there were over 100 bronze gateways within the river. Now, this Isaiah 45 correlation parallels almost shockingly with number 45, if you know who I'm talking about. When Cyrus campaigned against Babylon, he actually led 2 sieges. And Babylon knew he was a rising power, and he was taking nations left and right. So they sent an army outside the city to meet him on his first campaign. But Cyrus easily defeated them. So what did the Babylonians do? They retreated back into the city and they shut themselves in. But they figured out that they had stocked up enough supplies to outlast any siege up to 100 years. So they just said, look, we have all this food saved up. We're going to stay safe. And you guys, while you're camping out there waiting for us to open the doors, you're just going to end up starving. That's what they figured. But Cyrus was different. Like I said, nations called him benevolent because he instituted freedoms and rights. Like the Bill of Rights can be traced back to his empire. He even promoted freedom of religion in the satrapies where there were other cultures and other traditions. But Herodotus, who is a Greek historian, basically the father of modern historians, say that he may have read Isaiah because some of these references to double doors and bronze, and even some of the words in this passage, which we'll go over, really parallel exactly what he ended up doing. The word crooked comes from the Hebrew word hadar, which can also mean swollen. And that is a reference to the swollen river. And if you make the river level, you can walk through just on the riverbed. And that's what he ended up doing, actually. He ended up diverting the Euphrates River by creating over 100 tributaries upstream to channel the river out, thus draining the swamp. And the funny thing is that Isaiah died over 100 years before this all happened. So was Isaiah a false prophet? No, far from it. And that's what we got to look at in our own time. Though it doesn't look like it, and yeah, the Babylonians are partying, and they're using the golden vessels of Yahweh's temple to salute their gods of materialism. You know, like Belshazzar saluted the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. They're celebrating inside. But Cyrus is doing things. Heaven is literally invading this realm. And I'm just going to read the story of the account of the fall of Babylon from the book of Daniel. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing, and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now I'm going to skip ahead, but basically the queen tells him that, Daniel has all this insight, and your father Nebuchadnezzar actually made him master of all the magicians and the astrologers. So Daniel ends up being brought before Belshazzar to interpret this handwriting, but Daniel first rebukes the king and says, you know what? Nebuchadnezzar, as hard-headed as he was, he actually acknowledged the God of Israel. Continuing on, verse 18, O you, king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, and he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like an oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. And you, his son, O Belshazzar, has not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine in them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways, have you not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you are weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now the words Mene, Tekel, and Peres actually mean, like, Mene means to number something or to count, and Tekel is related to the Hebrew word shekel, which means to weigh, and Peres means to divide. These are basically terms that are used in the selling and marketing of grain. So you count the grain, you weigh the grain, and then you divide it by portions. But it's also a pun. Peres is a pun on the Persians. And if you look into the numerology of these words, there's quite some interesting numerology as well. But I won't be going into that in this episode. And it's very interesting because through all this exposure, one of the things that has been recently uncovered were the golden vessels of Solomon's temple. And guess where they were kept? In the tunnels underneath the Vatican. And that's coming out into the public right now, along with a whole lot of other things that have been kept hidden for centuries. So though the first victory outside Babylon didn't take them down, the second round, that is draining the river, is. And it is happening behind the scenes while the kingdom of Babylon thinks they have it made. But the writing is on the wall. And this kingdom is falling down, falling down, falling down, my fair lady. And I'm just going to close with the opening verses of the 47th chapter of Isha, where it says, "Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind meal. Uncover your locks. Make bare the leg. Uncover the thigh. Pass over the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered. Yea, your shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet you as a man." And that's what's happening right now. Literally, we're moving into a new era, and the exposure is happening on a level that has never been seen before. But the manipulators, the people that have usurped the power for the last several centuries, they cannot run and hide, because this power that is reclaiming the power back from them is legitimate. It is the rightful heir, and it is taking over this world for the name of divine source, for the name of truth, for the name of justice, and we will see things flip almost overnight, because this thing, it might look bleak, but there's things that are moving sub rosa underneath the surface that once they unfold and once they blow up in the public, we won't be able to deny it. We'll be so glad. There will be dancing in the streets and singing. We'll be eating cake. Literally, I'm not just wishful thinking here. This is happening, and the momentum is picking up. We're already starting to see the Canadian government had crazy lockdowns, and all of a sudden in 1 week, the cases have dropped 48% or something. In 1 week. That means that things are happening behind the scenes, because there's no way that would happen naturally. Mind you, this whole thing was unnatural. But that's a topic for another video, maybe on another platform. We'll see how that goes as these things unfold. But stay optimistic, because really, things are happening and heaven is invading this realm. So be on the leading edge, be on the right side of history, and we will enter into communally this utopia and literally create the world that we knew we were deserving of all along. I love you guys from the bottom of my heart. I really do. I'll see you in the next reasoning sesh. Joel signing out once again. Agape. Salaam. Namaste. Shalom.